Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Ancient Philosophy Podcast. I'm Doug Campbell, an assistant professor in the philosophy department at Alma College in Michigan. And I'm also the host of the Ancient Philosophy Podcast, which is the podcast that explores important topics in ancient philosophy, whether that's in Greece or Rome or India or China or the Near East or beyond. Today's episode is going to be an interview with Rachel O'Keefe, a professor who works and teaches at St. Thomas University in New Brunswick, Canada. And the topic is Plotinus's Metaphysics. We'll begin the episode by talking about Plotinus's life and who he was, about which we don't know that much, but we can highlight the most important details as they're filtered to us through his student Porphyry. And we'll also talk about the structure of his major work, the Enneads, which is a collection of essays or treatises put together by Porphyry. The important thing for you to know about Plotinus, as we say when we begin to look at the substance of his philosophy and his metaphysical views, is that Plotinus was a Neoplatonist philosopher. Some scholars might dislike the term Neoplatonist, and Plotinus himself would not have identified as a Neoplatonist, but he thought of himself, as all Neoplatonists thought of themselves, as people just following in the footsteps of Plato. Plato, who who was born in 428 BC and died in 348 BC, and as we'll see, Plotinus is writing many, many, many hundreds of years later, really at the tail end of antiquity, the period that philosophers refer to as late antiquity, and these are late ancient philosophers. Historians would call this the late imperial period, the empire in question being the Roman Empire. The major questions that concern us in this episode are things like, what's the nature of reality? What's the basic structure of reality? And as we'll see, Plotinus divides reality into two parts, the intelligible realm and the sensible realm. These words referring to how we come to know the things in each realm. Sensible meaning we sense it, we perceive it. These are corporeal things that we can identify and grasp through the senses, through our body. And then the intelligible realm, meaning that these are things that we can grasp only by means of the intellect. One term that comes up repeatedly in this episode, one phrase, is Platonic form. Rachel does a good job explaining this term as it comes up, but just to prime you or to understand this idea, form is a term that we find in Plato, for which reason we scholars refer to them as Platonic forms. But these are intelligible versions of things that we find in the sensible realm. So, for example, we find hot things in the sensible realm. Things are hot. We therefore identify in the intelligible realm something we call the form of heat, or the hot. And you can think of this as a blueprint or a model or a paradigm that is entirely intelligible. It's only graspable by the mind of that thing. A form is a version or a paradigm of things we find on Earth. So again, hot things here in the sensible realm, form of hot in the intelligible realm. There are squirrels in the sensible realm. There's a form of squirrel in the intelligible realm. There are beautiful things in the sensible realm. There's a beautiful thing in the intelligible realm. The idea here is that we encounter beautiful things, but we think about beauty itself. We think about what it means for something to be beautiful independently of any particular beautiful thing. Hence, we think about the form of beauty. So this is something that we're going to encounter through this episode. And again, Rachel does a good job of explaining that term as it comes up, that Platonic forms are models or paradigms or blueprints of things in the sensible realm. The role this plays in Plotinus' view is he identifies a thing called the intellect with a capital I that is thinking about the forms, the blueprints, without thinking about things in the sensible realm. So I can think about beautiful things and also what it means to be beautiful, but the intellect is thinking about the form of beauty. In fact, the intellect is thinking about all the forms, but without thinking about particular beautiful things. It thinks about the form of humanity without thinking about me. It thinks about the form of mortality without thinking about mortal things like me. And this it plays an important role in Plotinus's metaphysics and is an important part of the legacy that Plotinus inherits as a Neoplatonist, but again, he would have thought of himself as simply a Platonist. Last thing before we jump into the interview, if you want to subscribe to the Ancient Philosophy podcast, you can wherever you find podcasts, such as on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We also have a YouTube channel with video episodes available, and I have a Substack, platosfishtrap.substack.com. I hope you enjoy the interview as much as I enjoyed getting a chance to speak with Rachel O'Keefe, professor at St. Thomas University in New Brunswick, Canada. Thanks, Rachel, for coming on. I appreciate it. So, Plotinus might not be a name that people recognize. I mean, he's a major figure in the history of ancient philosophy for sure, but definitely late in antiquity, later than bigger players like Plato and Aristotle. Could you say something about who this guy is and what his major text is, namely the Enneads?
So you're right that Plotinus is one of those names that is both really famous and in no way famous at all, and is from this part of ancient history that we tend to totally forget about. So Plotinus lived from about 204 or 205 AD to 270. So that places him pretty firmly in the later years of the Roman Empire. So he was born and raised in Roman Egypt. So although Plotinus writes in Greek, and I think that we think that he's ethnically Greek, he was a citizen of the Roman Empire, and specifically a citizen of Egypt. We know astonishingly little about Plotinus in the same way that for a lot of ancient Greek figures, we know astonishingly little. Some people are even skeptical that he was born in Egypt. But we do have this really great feature that's always tacked on at the beginning of his Enneads, which is written by his student who's named Porphyry, and it's called The Life of Plotinus. And in this section of the Enneads, we get something that's halfway between like a memoir of Porphyry's time with Plotinus, a little bit of hagiography because there's all these stories about the kind of person he was to make him seem super amazing. But we do get a few other details, which is that Plotinus traveled pretty widely. He was pretty well connected in Rome. He eventually moved to Rome. And he actually had little seminars in the homes of upper class people in Rome, where everyone was welcome, including women. And we also hear that there were lots of like kids around. So this is just like this little weird, heartwarming thing we know about Plotinus. But other than that, we don't know a lot. What we do know, thanks to Porphyry, is that Plotinus, somewhere around the age of 27, turned to philosophy. He wasn't a philosopher before. He spent a really long time just studying philosophy. And then somewhere around the age of 49, he began writing down some of his philosophy. Porphyry tells us he didn't write for a really long time because he made a vow not to reveal his teacher's teachings. Not clear how true that is, but we hear from Porphyry he started writing at the age of 49. Porphyry says by the time he met Plotinus about 10 years later, so when Plotinus was 59, Plotinus had written 21 books. And I encourage you to think of those books as referring to treatises that are in this one big corpus we have from Plotinus called the Enneads. And I'm going to say a little bit about the Enneads and their structure in a moment. And so Porphyry tells us Plotinus had written about 21 of these treatises. By the time he was 59, he said that they weren't really widely circulated, but some people did manage to get their hands on copies. The works didn't have titles as they were written at the time, but they have titles now. Those titles were given to them at a later date. It seems like it's not Porphyry, but like they just kind of got given shorthand names by the people that were passing these around, these sort of like bootleg copies of what Plotinus thought. And then Porphyry says he wrote 24 more treatises while Porphyry was his student, over the course of those 10 years. And then in the last 5 years of Plotinus's life, Porphyry says he wrote another 9 treatises. So all of the stuff we have from Plotinus, he effectively wrote in the last couple decades of his life, according to Porphyry, last 21 years of his life. Those treatises, while Plotinus was alive and then after he died, were edited by his student Porphyry and gathered together into this collection we now call the Enneads. It's called Ennead because of the Greek word for nine, henia. And Porphyry has divided Plotinus's treatises into 6 books of 9 treatises. So we get 54 treatises total, 6 nines. That's what we get from Porphyry. And Porphyry says that Plotinus had written 21 treatises, then 24, then 9. But we actually now think that Porphyry split up some of the treatises so that he could get his 9 by 6 collection. So some of them, for example, so we usually say the book number, Ennead 1, Ennead 2, Ennead 3, and then we give the treatise number. So, for example, Enneads 6, 1, 2, and 3. So those are the first three treatises of the 6th book that we have in the collected works, the Enneads. Those are part 1, part 2, part 3. So it seems as though they're a single treatise, but Porphyry has chopped it into 3 because it's really long and because Porphyry is really obsessed with getting these 6 books of 9 treatises. So that's how we get this text, the Enneads. We have everything that Plotinus wrote, we think. It's all contained in one edition, usually. And so that's what we have from Plotinus.
Yeah, do you think that Porphyry's editing reflects some kind of order of importance of Plotinus's essays? I mean, like, for example, someone might say Ennead 5.1 provides like the basics of Plotinus's metaphysics. So I don't believe that they're in the order that Plotinus actually wrote them in. So what reflects the ordering? Do we know anything about why they're ordered the way they're ordered?
We do, actually. Porphyry was extraordinarily immodest. So if you ever read the life of Plotinus, it's also a little bit the life of Porphyry. He frequently will say, I, Porphyry. So it's just a sort of funny little quirk. And Porphyry is not shy in talking about his editing of Plotinus's texts. So yeah, so we're going to talk about 5.1 today. Whenever you look at editions of Plotinus's Enneads, you'll often get 2 numbers corresponding to a treatise. So 5.1 is the first treatise of Book 5 of the Enneads. In our edition, the most recent edition, the Cambridge University Press edition, you'll see in brackets a 10 next to 5.1. And so what that means is that this was actually the 10th chronologically that Plotinus wrote. And even weirder, if you go back to the very beginning of the Enneads and you look at Ennead 1, Treatise 1, we find out that that is number 53 in chronological order. There's only 54. So the Enneads start with the second last thing that Plotinus ever wrote. So we're lucky that Porphyry was enough of a nerd that he wanted to talk to us about his editorial decisions. So we get 2 things from Porphyry about the logic of the ordering. First, Porphyry preserves for us the chronological order. We know which ones were written in which order because Porphyry tells us. He tells us which were the 21 Plotinus wrote before he met Plotinus and in which order, the ones he wrote with Plotinus and the ones he wrote after Porphyry stopped being his student. So we're lucky about that. And then Porphyry also tells us that he had a bit of a rationale. And he tried to put treatises that were thematically related to one another in the same book. So Ennead 1, for example, is ethics and maybe loosely, very weakly politics. Plotinus is not a very big political thinker, which is funny because one anecdote we know about him is that he tried to get the emperor at the time to help him establish Platinopolis. He wanted to make a city based on Plato's Republic in a little town outside of Rome. Um, and so Porphyry tells us, okay, book one is about that. Books two and three are about the natural world or the sensible realm for the most part. So we get discussions of qualities, we get discussions of astrology, of the structure of the cosmos. So then in Ennead 4, we have treatises that are largely concerned with the structure of the soul. Then in Ennead 5, we get treatises that are largely concerned with the intellect, one of the three hypostases, and we'll talk about that later. And then book 6, we get some discussions of the one in book 6, but we also get some really nitty-gritty, abstruse, getting into the really fine details of the metaphysics of substance and of bodies. So you get the most abstract stuff in book 6. And so you get the impression that that Porphyry has started with the gentler subjects and he's moving towards the more difficult ones. But having said all of that, there's a really peculiar thing about reading Plotinus, which is every treatise seems to be like a microcosm for his entire system. And so to divide them up by subject is actually extraordinarily hard. But that's the rationale that Porphyry's given us.
Well, thank you. I mean, you mentioned the term "the one" there, and we're gonna circle back to that idea shortly because it's super, super, super important. And I appreciate the illumination of the order because that really is fascinating to know that each Aeneid, each set of nine, reflects some kind of thematic or has some kind of thematic organizing principle. That's super cool. And I see the point that that each one of the treatises is like a microcosm of the whole because that does reflect what a systematic thinker Plotinus is. I mean, we hear about the same sorts of principles, if we want to call them principles, being appealed to again and again. But I will say, and I'm sure you won't disagree with me here, that reading Plotinus is like jumping into a pool of concrete. I mean, his prose is nearly impenetrable. The fact that, and certainly that's true in the ancient Greek, and the recent translations, like those by Gerson et al., if by Cambridge University Press recently, like they do something to help make the prose be a little bit more digestible, smooth, like a flow a little bit more smoothly. But there's only so much you can do with a thinker like Plotinus. I wonder whether there is something of philosophical significance or importance about why the prose is impenetrable. I mean, sometimes in the history of philosophy, but certainly not always, someone's writing style does reflect some kind of commitment they hold or value they hold. I mean, Plato in the dialogue format is just a natural example of that. Do you think there's something important about the way that Plotinus writes, which is to say, very, very, very impenetrably?
Yeah, that's a great question because I'm often asked by people, where should I start with Plotinus? You know, they hear that I work on him. And usually my response is just, I don't know how much you actually want to dig into Plotinus because he's so difficult. I think there's two kinds of philosophers that are difficult to read. There are philosophers like Heidegger who profess that the reason their language is so impenetrable is because they're trying to talk about the kinds of things that break our existing language. And they're trying to get at what is so fundamental and what is so hard to grasp that they're having to invent words like ontic and so on. And then you have other philosophers who are sort of notorious for how bad their language is, and no one really tries to defend it. So Kant is an obvious person for this, right? The Critique of Pure Reason is brutal to bang your head against. And Kant himself says in the preface of the second edition, he says, many a book would be clearer if not so much effort had been made to be clear. So Kant is like owning how bad his language is. And I don't usually recall anyone defending Kant's language. Plotinus, I think, mostly falls into the camp with a touch of Heidegger. So some of the reason Plotinus is so impenetrable is because the things he's talking about are so beyond the realm of normal human comprehension that his language is going to reflect that. So especially when we start talking about these higher principles like the one and the intellect and so on, I think some of the difficulty in the language there is just because it's conceptually really quite difficult. That having been said, all of Plotinus is impenetrable, regardless of the subject of the treatise. And I don't think this is on purpose. We once again get to enjoy the life of Plotinus written by Porphyry because Porphyry tells us Plotinus, terrible writer. Plotinus had really bad grammar. So when you read Plotinus's Greek, it's really hard to make your way through because his grammar isn't particularly good. Porphyry tells us that he had to fix a lot of spelling mistakes because Plotinus was just a really bad speller. He actually says that Plotinus would sometimes mix up syllables. And so in our translation, he says, oh, instead of remember, Plotinus would sometimes say "merember." Like so he indicates that Plotinus has this problem also in speech. And then the last thing he tells us is because Plotinus was so old when he did this, and he also tells us Plotinus was quite ill. He just literally couldn't reread his own manuscripts. So he basically just stream of consciousness wrote down the Enneads according to Porphyry, and poor Porphyry had to do his best to clean it up because Plotinus literally couldn't read his own handwriting to go back and edit them. So some of it, maybe it's because of the content, but it's actually quite funny that we hear from Porphyry that Plotinus was just an atrocious writer.
Yeah, I mean definitely really helpful to hear that point about what Porphyry thought about his writing because I mean as you mentioned there's a hagiographic element to Porphyry's writing, and so it's telling that the bad writing style doesn't get kind of polished over, that yes, we can praise this guy very, very, very much, but there's no denying what's plainly obvious to everyone, namely his writing. Even if his impenetrable prose isn't deliberate, and it sounds like it wasn't deliberate. I still do think it does serve I mean, it helps me as a reader, as someone who's not a specialist on Plotinus at all. It helps me because you cannot possibly fail to pay attention when reading Plotinus. Because if you're not paying attention, you're not getting anything out of the text. Like it keeps you working. I mean, and realistically, the only way I've ever found to read Plotinus profitably is to sit there with notes and try to take notes and summarize each paragraph as it's appearing on the page. And so, yeah, I mean, it sounds like it wasn't deliberate. And this guy's bad writing extends even to, confusing syllables, but it does become kind of helpful as a reader. But obviously, it'd be more helpful as a reader if he actually wrote better.
I like the point about how his writing is because we often when we read ancient authors, it's often quite cognitively difficult for us because we
Mhm.
weren't born and raised reading ancient Greek and Latin, and the way we typically learn how to read these languages is not a way that produces a kind of facility with the language.
Yeah.
And so it's very interesting to have someone who spends a bunch of time talking about how Plotinus was the most amazing guy ever and how he knew everything, he read everything, and nonetheless, here's the one flaw this amazing, perfect guy had could not write to save his life.
Yeah.
So it's a good point. We know just how bad it was if even Porphyry.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And now you've mentioned Plotinus's principles a few times. I mean, you use the phrase higher principle. Let's talk a little bit about the principles. So sometimes these things, and you can correct my use of this vocabulary because I do think the vocabulary needs some illumination here. But sometimes these are often called hypostases. You've mentioned the one, you've mentioned the intellect. Can you say something about what these principles are, and if and if you decide it's more useful, you can describe what hypostasis means first, or you can describe what these things are first. But as we're going to see, there are going to be three of these. And so, could you shine some light on what the heck these things are, the hypostases?
I'll do my best to shine some light on them. So, yeah, so the treatise that we're going to talk about, 5.1, it's been given this title on the three primary hypostases. So, this is a term that we do find in the title of this text. So, it might help a little bit just to get a very, very brief understanding of how Plotinus understands the structure of the cosmos. So Plotinus is, I can't believe I didn't say this before, but Plotinus is a Neoplatonist. We usually think of him as being the founder of the Neoplatonic school, which means that some of what Plotinus thinks is going to be familiar to people who are experienced in reading Plato. And so Plato makes this distinction between the visible realm and the intelligible realm. And Plotinus does as well. He talks about the sensible realm, which he often calls here. So you can imagine the world that you and I are readily inhabiting. And then he talks about the intelligible world, which he often shortens to there. And so these three hypostases or principles, those exist in the intelligible realm. They do not exist in the world as we perceive and interact with it on a regular everyday basis. He posits three of them, and I invite you to think of these as three levels of reality. Um, and why would you posit an intelligible realm? Well, there's two reasons. One, because you want to explain the origin of the sensible realm. How is it that this world that you and I inhabit came to exist? Well, we're going to explain that in terms of these principles or hypostases that are beyond it, that existed prior to it, that exist even outside of time for some of these. Again, this might sound familiar to anyone who's read Plato's Timaeus. This is some riffing on what goes on in the Timaeus. But we also might posit these as what we could call epistemic principles. And so my ability to understand and make sense of this world might rely on my understanding these things that form the causal origin of this world. So you get a sort of hierarchical system. So I'll just lay out what the hierarchical system is. So we have the sense world that you and I exist in. Below that world is matter, which Plotinus calls non-being. This doesn't really get a lot of attention in this treatise, so I'm not going to talk about it, but you're welcome to ask me about it. And then above that, the first level above the sensible realm is what he calls soul. Then above that, we have what he calls intellect. And as we move up, you can imagine these things are getting more and more perfect and they're getting more and more unified. And we'll end up talking about why this unity stuff is important. And then there's above the intellect, there's the one. And this is the absolutely first principle of all things. It is entirely uncaused. There is no thing that is responsible for it. And so you can, once you work your way up the ladder, you can think your way down it. So the one generates the intellect generates the soul, and then soul generates bodies, the sensible world. So are these things principles? What does it mean to call them hypostases? So they are principles in one sense, because the word principle is often the Greek word arche, which means origin or beginning. And so they are principles insofar as they are originators or causes for anything that's below them, right? So the one is a cause of everything that's below it, which is going to be intellect, soul, sensible world. The intellect is a cause for everything that's below it. So that's going to include soul and sensible world, but it's not going to include the one. And soul is a principle, but only for the sensible realm because it's only responsible for that. So when we call them principles, it's important to think of the word principle as being a functional term. So whether something is a principle depends on in relation to what. If you're talking about the soul in relation to intellect, then soul is not a principle. But if you're talking about soul in relation to the world of bodies, then soul is a principle. So it's Aristotle's term matter functions similarly. It's a functional term depending on the relationship we're talking about. So it's often more accurate to call them hypostases. What does hypostasis mean? How is it different from a principle? So this word hypostasis, hypostasis in Greek, so it comes from this Greek verb hupistemi. And by the time that Plotinus writes it, it's got these connotations of being or existing or so the Stoics use this word for subsistence because Stoics want to talk about subsistence as distinct from existence. But it's a being-like term. And so you could also think of these as beings or realities or even substances maybe, but they are true, real things. And what that gets us is that it captures the fact that they're only in the intelligible realm. So anything there is a real being. So hypostasis captures this. And to call them hypostases, to call them beings or real beings, is helpful in two ways. One, it is helpful because we're going to talk about this, but it turns out soul is not actually a single thing. It also, internal to it, contains all of our souls. So your soul, Doug, is in soul. My soul is in soul. The soul that moves the earth is inside soul. And so when we talk about the hypostasis soul, we're talking about it kind of as a unified being, but also it has many parts. It's very diverse. Similarly, the intellect, and we'll get into how this works, but the intellect contains within it all what Plotinus calls intelligibles, but are basically the Platonic forms. So the Platonic forms exist at the level of intellect. So to talk about reality or a level of reality rather than just a single principle captures something about it. And then I had thought as I was trying to think of explaining hypostasis, I was like, oh, maybe you could think of them as like substances or ousiai. But you have to be careful with that because the one, strictly speaking, is beyond being. So maybe Plotinus also calls them hypostases because he likes that it's a being-like word without meaning being in such a way that it doesn't properly apply to the one, which is the absolutely first principle of all things.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that was a very full answer and really shines such a big light on this for sure. I mean, I definitely see the Platonic provenance or heritage of this, right? The idea that Plato, I mean, most famously in Socrates' autobiography in the Phaedo, introduces introduces the intelligible to explain something about the causal origins of the sensible world. That it's in his search for causes that he introduces the intelligibles. And then I also appreciate what Plotinus is doing there by trying to introduce this hierarchy. And I take the point that when we're asking about whether something's a principle, in a certain sense, we're asking whether, as you said, it's an origin, a beginning, but we could also think of them as sources. So really, when we're asking whether the soul is a source, we mean with respect to what? I mean, we're not going to say that the soul is a source with respect to the intellect, because as you pointed out, intellect is the thing that is the source of soul. And meanwhile, the one is a source of intellect, and then the intellect source of soul. Soul is, in a way, I'm assuming, then we can say that soul is, in a way, the source of bodies. I mean, could you say something about? Could you now fit the sensible world into this picture? There's a hierarchy in the intelligible that in a way, sort of like a cascade or a waterfall, ultimately results in the origination of this world, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So Plotinus's hierarchy, as I said, progresses. Each level is more good and more unified than the one below. And so Plotinus thinks the one is absolutely simple, it's perfectly unified, and it's perfectly good, it's lacking nothing. The intellect is as close to being perfectly unified as possible, but we now get multiplicity at this level. So the best way to think about the intellect is it's something like Aristotle's unmoved mover, thought thinking thought. But Plotinus critiques Aristotle because he says it can't just be bare thought. There has to be contents. So there are many things at the level of the intellect, and that is the things that the intellect is thinking. But those things are internal to the intellect. So you can imagine the intellect as being something like this divine mind that has within it all of the paradigms or forms of all the things that could ever exist. And it thinks them. And it thinks them all of the time and all at once. It's all perfectly transparent. Then at the next level, you have soul, and soul is now where you get this. You're thinking with more complexity. You are now not thinking just about the form of human being. You're thinking about particular human beings. You're having thoughts that happen one after another. So this is often called discursive reasoning. So when you're asking me this question and I'm trying to reach into my head and pull out all of the things that I know so that I can articulate them to you, that's what's happening. And because we're getting to a level of particularity, I can't think of all of these things all at once. I can't hold them all together. So soul has a little more multiplicity there. And then below soul is the sensible realm. And for Plotinus, the sensible realm has no real unity at all. It's just a mishmash of stuff that isn't obviously connected in any way whatsoever. It's almost pure multiplicity. So I'm sitting here and there's my keyboard, there's my computer, there's my mic, there's my coffee mug. My coffee is so separate from me that I have to reach over, pull it closer to me, put it up to my mouth, swallow it, and then I got to work on digesting it. And it's not at all clear what explains or unifies the universe. So here's this weird thing is we have the sensible world and it's full of a bunch of things doing their own motions, doing their own activities, and it's truly a mystery how any of it works together. The universe seems to be somewhat orderly and somewhat regular, but it's a bunch of very different things doing different things. So, one of the things we have to explain for Plotinus is how can there be so much unity? How can there be unity in so much multiplicity? Right? How do the planets manage to have this like perfect set of motions around one another? Why is it's December here and the snows come in December and they don't come in July? How do all those factors organize one another? And Plotinus's answer is, well, there must be something that's more unified, that's like pulling the strings. How can a puppet move its many limbs in unison, even though they're not connected with one another? Well, because a puppeteer with one hand is able to move the strings. So Plotinus posits greater and greater unity to explain the coordination that happens at levels of increasing multiplicity.
Yeah, thanks. So we'll return to the idea of the one as absolutely simple in a moment, or perhaps more than a moment, but it's definitely the next item on the agenda for sure. If I were to say then that the fact that the sensible world lacks unity the soul in a certain sense isn't nearly as united as intellect and certainly not as one is, but you could still say that there's some unity to soul. Is the reason is the fact that the sensible world is not united in the same way the intelligible or items in the intelligible world are united? Is that why Plotinus would not call the sensible world a hypostasis? Is that why he says, look, there are only these three hypostases and they're just the sort of hierarchical levels in the intelligible. That's it. That's all. I mean, to the extent that no one's going to deny the sensible world is a thing, or exists in some meaning of the word existence, one might wonder why that the sensible world isn't a hypostasis too, or that there isn't some hypostasis in the sensible world. Is the lack of unity the reason why he would deny that?
Yeah, so there's this is why I said that Uziah kind of fits with hypostasis with the little
Yeah,
asterisk that you wouldn't want to use it because the one
yeah.
technically is not being. Yeah, so Plotinus again is being somewhat Platonic here, where Plato has this distinction between becoming and beings. So beings are things that are, you know, like a being is itself by itself. It's unified. It's not lacking things. It's not dependent on other things, and so on and so forth. And so this is part of what's so confusing about Plotinus is hypostasis. It's not quite a principle, and we do have levels of reality. So you might ask, well, the sensible realm is a level of reality.
Hmm.
Why doesn't that get the label hypostasis? And I think the reason is that if we think of the definition of hypostasis as picking out real being, there's a bit of an unreality to the sensible world. It exists, right? It's there, but also it's in flux. It's always changing. So to give an example of the unity of my soul versus my body, for example. So my body changes over time, right? And so I was once a teeny tiny baby that weighed nothing more than 7 pounds. And now I weigh significantly more than that. We know something about how my cells die and are
Hmm.
replaced. Our bodies are a sort of ship of Theseus problem. How am I the same thing because no part of me actually persists all of the time across time. I
Yeah.
can cut off pieces of my hair, but I still seem to be unified. But the soul is something that is not altered in these ways. So that's going to be there's something unreal. There's something almost fictitious about the sensible world for Plotinus, and that's why he's going to deprive it this title of hypostasis. And the last thing I want to say is sometimes we think that like a hypostasis could be something like a criterion for positing that as a like a category or something like this. Something like what we get Stoic categories or Aristotelian categories. It's clear that whatever hypostasis is for Plotinus, it's not that. It's not a criterion for positing that as being a thing. A hypostasis is not a thing. It's like a buffed up thing. It's a substance. It's a being that is in many ways not. It has internal unity. It's in some way self-sufficient.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, it does sound like Plotinus then is following this really Platonic idea that there actually is a certain sense in which the sensible world doesn't really exist. That because that it, of course it exists in our 21st century common sense idea of the word exists, where existence means something maybe like it is present in space and time. But when Plato invents the distinction between becoming and being, he's basically granting the sensible world some kind of ontological status. It doesn't have the same status as absolutely nothing, but it is, but also the actual set of existence or set of things that are is something that you could really only identify in the intelligible realm. And it sounds like Plotinus is following that. Of course, this is all going to be complicated in a second when we go to the one. So let's go there now. Can you say something about what the one is and in what way he says that it's beyond being?
Yeah. So this is going to be where I had said that Plotinus's impenetrability is mostly not intentional. Once we start talking about the one, it's going to get extraordinarily hard to grasp what's going on. And Plotinus's hierarchy that I talked about is helpful because we talked about discursive reasoning happening at the level of souls. That's also where language is for Plotinus. Plotinus, right? The fact that I have to draw out in words the content of my thoughts, that's where language happens. We have two levels above language. And you can kind of sometimes grasp what's going on with the intellect, but it gets really quite hard when we get to the one. So yeah, so what is this thing, the one? So Plotinus also calls it the good. He'll use those two terms interchangeably. For the most part, I'll call it the one because I think for Plotinus, ultimately, if he's really careful and he wants to say that, there's no distinction whatsoever in the one, but if speaking loosely, I had to say one of its properties is prior to the other, I would say its oneness is prior to and explicative of its goodness. What is it to be good for Plotinus? It's to be one. I think that conceptually its oneness is in many ways prior to its being the good. So as we mentioned, Plotinus is worried about a unity that can explain multiplicity. Anytime you have multiple things for Plotinus, you need to explain how it is they came to exist and how it is that they come to interact with one another. And so if a soul is thinking lots of different thoughts, we need to have something that makes that possible. How is it that I can connect two thoughts together? Well, it's actually because those things are in some important way conceptually related at a higher level of abstraction. So that's the way the intellect explains the soul. And then you get to the intellect and you have all the Platonic forms, and they're all like kind of enmeshed and interacting, and they're all in this big mind. And Plotinus says, okay, but I still need to explain some, I still need something to be the origin, the unifier of that. And he says, okay, it's the one. But in order for this to not go on indefinitely, I need to have something. It needs to stop somewhere. It can't be turtles all the way down. We need a spot that it stops. And he says it was going to stop with this thing that is absolutely simple. He says it's beyond all being because to be is to be multiple. So, what it is to be a human being is to have various features, right? To be rational, to be an animal, maybe to be bipedal. We can to be a human being is to have multiple properties, and to understand a human being is to unify all those properties together. But Plotinus says so being is always multiple. To be is to always be a particular kind of thing. So if we want to get rid of all multiplicity whatsoever, we couldn't even talk about it, right? If there is a thing and that thing has even one property, that property is distinct from the thing because to be a property is to belong to a thing that is distinct from you. And so that's why we're going to have this absolutely simple first thing, according to Plotinus. Because it's simple, nothing needs to explain how its parts came to be together, because if anything is multiple, it's possible for it to be a part. If it's absolutely simple, we don't have to, it's missing nothing. So that's where its goodness is going to be. So there is nothing that it lacks. But this is where Plotinus's language starts to break down because he says, because it's beyond being, it's also beyond intelligibility because he connects being with being intelligible. And in 5.1, he says, Parmenides got it right, that intelligibility and being go hand in hand. And so there's this weird thing where you can't even really intellectually grasp the one because it's beyond being because it is so abstract and so simple.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from with that. I mean, like, if I were to say that I want to understand some book and then I learn about it and I come to understand it, that process of coming to understand it would be a process of learning about its characteristics and features. But if we want to deny that the one has features, has characteristics, and we have to deny that because we want to affirm its absolute simplicity, then it's really difficult to think what it would be like to understand that thing or talk about that thing because again when we talk about something just like when we come to understand it when we're talking about it we are identifying some of its features and if it doesn't have that so we're talking about the one and I believe, and you can shine some light on this too if you want, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when we're talking about oneness, we are in a certain sense literally talking about unity, like in some etymological sense. I mean, people who know languages other than English will be familiar with this, but like when we talk about when we use the French word un or we are talking about one or oneness or a thing. And that's clearly where our word unity is coming from. There's some Latin origin that makes sense of that. But the idea is that unity is oneness and oneness is unity. But then we still want to say in Plotinus's metaphysics, so Plotinus still wants to say that the one is nevertheless a source of multiplicity, of complexity, of difference. And so after all, it's going to give rise to the intellect. How can something that's absolutely simple play the metaphysical role or the cosmological role of giving rise to difference, complexity, multiplicity, and so on? How do we square this circle? How do we make sense of that?
I want to start this out by saying this is the big mystery of Plotinus's system. And so Plotinus is what we call a principal monist, right? So I said that you can kind of talk about there being different principles, but ultimately he thinks there's one first principle that everything else comes from. Contrast that with someone who's a dualist, right? And they think there are at least two principles. So you could say that, and some of Aristotle's reports about Plato suggest Plato was a dualist in this way. And Plato says there's the one on according to Aristotle's account, which is the source of unity, and there's the indefinite dyad, which is the source of multiplicity. And then everything happens as a result of those two principles interacting. You get to be satisfied with that. You have an answer to this question, whence multiplicity, because it's fundamental to the system. Plotinus doesn't want to do that for a variety of reasons, one of which being if there's another principle, then you have to explain how those two principles can interact with one another. And then you need another principle, right? So Plotinus thinks it's philosophically stronger to have a single principle. But as with any position you could take on a philosophical topic, you have to bite a bullet somewhere. And the bullet Plotinus has to bite is he now has this mystery of how multiplicity can come out of unity or absolute oneness. And he gives us many metaphors for this. And I recall as you were reading this, you said to me, I wonder if Plotinus thought his metaphors were actually useful at all. And Plotinus gets to have a little bit of a sleight of hand here because suppose there actually is a way to make this claim intelligible. It is happening at such a far remove from the way the average human intellect works that it would actually be quite mysterious to us, even if we could grasp it. So I think of this as being analogous to the doctrine of the Trinity, where you somehow need three persons to be one person. And we can talk about it all day long, but ultimately it's a mystery of faith because we're talking at a level that's beyond human concepts. So Plotinus, I think, gets a little bit of wiggle room because of that. That nothing he's going to be able to say about is really going to be able to articulate what's happening. I just wanted to say one last thing about language before I go on to attempting to give you an answer to this, which is when you talked about unity and applying it to things, Plotinus calls the one, but the way in which the one is different from the way in which you and I are one. You are a bunch of parts that have been unified. You're a unified multiplicity. That's the way you're one. But the one has no parts. So Plotinus will often describe the one, and when he talks about it, he'll add this Greek particle hoion, which basically means like or as it were. So he's constantly flagging that he's calling it one, but what it means for the one to be one is very hard to understand. And so we get this preview of apophantic ways of talking about the first principle or God. So that's Plotinus's little like back pocket trick, which is that necessarily, of course, it's going to be largely unintelligible, but he tries anyway. And so he compares. I liked your use of cascade. He compares the one to a fount, a wellspring from which water just surges indefinitely, and the water when it's inside the spring is, it's unified and it's down to this little point. And it's only when it leaves the spring that it sprays everywhere. And we might ask ourselves, well, how could something that was super contained cause the spraying out in this way? Or he'll also compare the one to a dot at the center of a circle, and then the intellect is a circle, and the one is the dot in the middle. And he compares the intelligibles to the radii that come off the middle of the circle. And again, you could ask, well, how could a point create those things? But it's as soon as they leave the point that many radii can happen. And then he also compares it to the sun and the rays of the sun. And this question of how can the one do it, Plotinus's answer is he doesn't really explain how it can happen, but he tells us it's metaphysically necessary. Because if there was anything other than the one, it would have to be multiple. Because what the one is absolutely simple. And if there's something other than the one, it has to be non-identical to the one. What is it to be non-identical to the one? It's to be diffuse, it's to be multiple. And he also, this is, I think, going to touch on some stuff you want to talk about. So I'll sort of like presage it here, but he does say, well, the multiplicity that comes from the one is almost like pure potentiality. And it's not until all of this miasma that comes out of the one turns back to look at it that it becomes an actual multiplicity. So Aristotle's like tricky sleight of hand about potential versus actual infinities, I think Plotinus makes use of here. So the one just spits out something because it's just so full. It's so full of being, it's beyond being. How that happens, he doesn't really tell us. He just tells us it happened, and that thing had to have been multiple by metaphysical necessity.
Yeah, thank you. Like the image that popped into my head when you were speaking, and Plotinus might take issue with some part of this image, but it makes sense to me that you might think of it in terms of like the way that light shown through a prism breaks into all the colors of the rainbow. You might wonder how can all these colors be contained in this one thing that doesn't actually resemble any of them, but and yet it does. That sounds like to me a way to at least make sense of this in some my mind. I'm sure Plotinus might have something to quibble about that, but I also think that any Platonist is probably not going to object to an image that involves light. So does that like approximate what Plotinus is trying to describe in any way?
Yes, and in fact, that image I believe comes from Damascus. You
Okay.
and I both know this image because you and I have both been students of Professor Lloyd Gerson, who is fond of making use of this image
Yeah.
because it's really quite helpful. If you look at Lloyd Gerson's Plato's Moral Realism, he actually has something that seems to indicate that. One of the things that's frustrating about Plotinus is he uses vocabulary in lots of different ways. So talk about potentiality. So what first comes out of the one is identified as potentiality or dunamis.
Yeah.
But the one itself is often referred to as a dunamis, a power. And so the one has Yeah, so you can think of white light as potentially being all of the colors of the spectrum, but not potentially in the sense that it's incomplete. Like we would never say white light is perfected when it becomes these different colors. It's just that it contains those within it potentially because they are not realized. And then, yes, something about the shining forth is the moment that these things are refracted or realized.
Right. I now understand a little bit more clearly why the potentiality language is so fraught. Because on the one hand, it makes sense to describe as potential because it could become that. But that sometimes when I might say, look, like I'm potentially a cello player, you would infer from that that there's something deficient about me right now, namely I can't or I'm not playing the cello, but I could. And there's something missing, but that's what we want to deny about the one is that it is potential. It is or has or is the source of this potentiality, but don't confuse it. We're not saying that there's something that it's missing right now. That's what's fraught about the potentiality language. And you mentioned earlier, just maybe a few minutes ago, that like all of this stuff that flows from the one becomes an ordered, intelligible thing to us only when it looks back on the one, which fills out some of the language that we'll see. I mean, sometimes you'll hear this described as Plotinus's view of emanation. That's emanation with an E, meaning that like the flowing. But when we actually read, for example, the recent Cambridge translation, we instead find these two nouns slash verbs of procession and reversion, that like things proceed from the one, but then they revert back to whatever their source was when they sort of look to it. I'm intensely curious about whether these are metaphors or what the actual status of these words are. And you feel free to tackle that question first. But I'm also curious what the substance of these words actually is. What are we talking about? We're thinking about things proceed from the one and then they revert back to the one.
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to say just quickly, because we talked about potentially, I just wanted to say you're right. So this idea of potentiality indicating a deficiency is because we're often coming from Aristotle's physics, right? So we think about the discussion of matter in Physics Book 1 and 2, because potentiality is always looking towards actuality. And I just wanted to say, Plotinus has a whole treatise, Ennead 2.5, where he actually critiques Aristotle's view of potentiality. And I just wanted to mention this because part of what makes Plotinus so hard is that he loves using Aristotle's philosophy, but he also critiques it and repurposes it for his own system. And that's another thing that makes Plotinus extraordinarily hard to read. You need to know Aristotle really well, and then you need to know exactly how Plotinus does not use him. But yeah, so this precession and reversion stuff, this is also going to help us to understand what's unique about bodies and why it is that they don't get to count as a hypostasis. So for Plotinus, yeah, so we have this idea that these things flow out of the one, beams of light and so on. And yeah, so when they first flow out of the one, they're really diffuse, they're really indeterminate. So first the intellect flows out. One way of being unified is to be one thing for things to be unified is for them to be objects of thought for an intellect, right? That's so one way for me to be unified with you, Doug, is for me to be thinking about you. That is one way for me to be unified with you. You are, when I look at you, if I close my eyes and I can like picture you, there's a Doug that's internal to me, and this is a way in which we're unified. Um, and so that's probably that's like quite an intimate way of being unified. Whereas I can be unified with my mug insofar as I possess it and I'm holding it. But someone could come away and just like yank the mug out of my hand. So that's a weaker way of being unified. So whatever this first thing is, it's going to be an intellect because intellect is as close to being absolutely unified as possible. But an intellect is only a potential intellect until it has an object of thought. So the intellect, it's this blind, stumbling baby intellect. It's grasping around for anything to look at, um, and all it's got is the one, because the one is the only other thing that exists. And so it looks at the one, and somehow its grasping of the one, which is its origin, allows it to grasp itself in some way. And the grasping of itself is, it turns out to be its creation of itself because it is an intellect. So it's doing its intellect thing, and it is also intellecting itself. So when I think about myself, it's a way of unifying myself. So the procession is first the generation, non-temporal generation. This is before time. It's the procession is the generation, and the reversion is that thing turning back and contemplating that thing. Um, and so Plotinus will often compare the hypostases to like a sun or a fountain. He also says it's like fire just burns. Fire is not trying to give off heat. Heat just dissipates as a result of fire doing its fire activity. So the procession is like heat being given off from a fire. The same thing happens at the level of soul. Intellect, while it's doing its intellect thing, emanates or diffuses, gives off some stuff comes out of it, and that is soul. And when soul turns back towards intellect, it does the same kind of thing. It grasps intellect, and it also grasps itself. Then the soul emanates the sensible world. And this is where things peter out. Things in the sensible world are not powerful enough to turn back and look at the soul. And so the soul then has to come along and look after bodies and unify them. And so the task of soul actually is to unify the sensible world because it's so weak at this point. The power has been so depleted that the sensible world can't revert. So you get procession at the level of sensible world, but you do not get reversion. And these words, procession and reversion, are just a way for Plotinus to capture that movement. Of course, for the intellect, this doesn't happen in time. For the soul, this doesn't happen in time. This is all happening prior to time for Plotinus.
Yeah, I mean, whenever we think about something happening outside of time, it becomes difficult because our language is such that we frame these things as events, which are necessarily temporal. But the fact we're talking about some kind of timeless or atemporal emanation from or flowing from or procession from, and then the moment of reversion. The reversion is the one that I'm super interested in. Is the implication something like that? Everything that has a source desires unity with its source, such that like intellect desires the close, intimate kind of unification you mentioned, such that its reversion is like, hey, I'm from there and I want to get back to there. And the closest way I can is through thinking about it. And then soul is doing the same thing. Soul proceeds from intellect and it's like, hey, I want to get back to where I'm from. I'm going to do this in this way. And then nature, the sensible world, whatever, it proceeds from soul, but it is not capable of reversion. And so it doesn't have that second moment. But is the implication something about created or generated things? Or maybe those aren't the right words, but like dependent, contingent things that to the extent that the intellect depends on the one, its nature is such that it desires to get back to it. And that's just always the nature of contingent or dependent or generated things.
Yeah, I like that way of thinking about it. Yeah, Plotinus seems to think that that's the case. So what it is to be multiple for Plotinus is to not be entirely with yourself, to be separated from yourself. Now, at the level of intellect, the separation is extraordinarily weak. But the second you have otherness for Plotinus, there's a gap. There's a thing that you're lacking. Now, to lack yourself, where you're merely an object of thought for yourself or something like this, like that's like a fairly weak alienation. The level of soul gets more attenuated, gets it's more separate from yourself. But I just want to give you actually like a helpful citation for this. So in Ennead 5, Treatise 1, Chapter 1, right at the very end of the first chapter, almost at line like 35-ish, Plotinus says, you know, it doesn't make sense to say I'm seeking things that are alien to me. Like, what's the impetus for me to go towards something that's alien? He says, but if things are of the same lineage as us, it is fitting for us to seek them. So Plotinus seeks to be unified with itself. And part of being unified with ourselves is being unified with our origins. Plotinus is this very weird thing with the system where, so you and I both originate from the one. And we are definitely separate from the one, and we're separate from each other. But we also, at the same time, are still always present to the one. So Plotinus seems to have this, he has this nice hierarchy that he builds, but it also collapses quite tightly where Plotinus actually thinks he doesn't think you go to the one in the afterlife. He doesn't think that you are separated from the one such that you really have to work your way back to it. You actually are always present with the one somehow for Plotinus. And so he talks about our lineage and our origin, but also what I am is the one. Weirdly enough. So in the same way that I long to be with myself, and it is dear to me because it is me, I long to be with the one. And each level of reality is going to feel that way.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, on the so I'm seeing a bit of a dichotomy here. So like on the one hand, I'm of the same lineage as the one, and on the same hand, I'm always the one is always present with me. And then on the other hand, I'm different from the one. I'm also different from you. We're different from each other in a way that's typical of things in the sensible realm. And even our souls are different because the soul is diffused in a way that's typical of that hypostasis. It seemed to me, given from what you said earlier. I understand at some basic level that what's happening here is that every level of reality enjoys a certain level of difference or complexity or multiplicity than the previous level. And certainly, if you compare all of these levels of difference and or degree of difference or complexity, we compare these to the one, we would find that there's just like a totally an astronomical difference, an unfathomable difference, because the one has no multiplicity or complexity at all to it. One question that I'm left with is why? Why is there more difference as things go all the way down to the sensible, which is so devoid of power, it lacks the power even to revert back, as in turn back to the soul. Why do we have a cascade where things peter out? Someone else might think that if the one is the thing doing the generating of at least the intellect, that the one would create in a way a kind of copy of itself. As in, I take the point that there's difference, but why is there difference? Why does difference increase?
The answer for Plotinus is metaphysical necessity. So the one wants to create something else. That something else, in order to be other, needs to be distinguishable from the one. Any copy of the one, there needs to be something in virtue of which it is not, it is another item. So the one can't make anything better than itself because there's nothing better than what is absolutely simple and lacking nothing. So the one necessarily has to make what is worse than itself. And the one being good is not going to make what's really terrible. It's going to make the best possible thing that is less than itself. Then the intellect produces, and Plotinus thinks that these things produce almost automatically as a result of their goodness. Their goodness just overflows. He describes it as being overabundant. So then the intellect can't help but to overflow. What's the intellect going to make? Well, it can't make something better than itself because I'm not, like, it doesn't have the power to do that. It could make something that's identical to itself, I guess, but everything is already in the intellect. And so the intellect necessarily makes what's a little weaker than itself. That's going to be soul. And then soul necessarily makes what is a little weaker than itself. And by the time we get to the body, bodies are not powerful enough to make what's weaker than themselves. And there's just nothing else. Like, you can't get any worse than a body and still have any determination whatsoever. So Plotinus's story is going to be one of metaphysical necessity.
Yeah, and to return to this idea of like the one is of the same lineage as us. One of the most striking parts of 5.1 was the way that the treatise opened, namely with this discussion of the fact that the soul has forgotten its own lineage, which is a very striking way to open a treatise. And certainly we can understand the basic thought here pretty well at this point, because we now understand that there is a metaphysical hierarchy. At the bottom of it, in the intelligible realm, is soul, and then that gives rise to us, ultimately us in the sense of embodied creatures in the world we inhabit, in the sensible world we inhabit. And Plotinus says not only are we of the lineage of this metaphysical first principle of everything, namely the one, but we've also forgotten our lineage. Again, very striking phrase for him to use. Could you say something about what it means to have forgotten our lineage now that we understand what our lineage is, and why does he think this happens?
Yeah, so souls are these peculiar things for Plotinus, and Plotinus is really astonishingly interested in what we might call the phenomenology of being a soul. Um, and so, yeah, so we're from this lineage. We are a little further from the one than the intellect is, right? So we're more diffuse. And so souls have this peculiar status where they're halfway between the intellect and the intelligible world. Um, and so the soul you should think of for Plotinus as having its own miniature hierarchy. It's got its own layers, its own parts. And so part of the soul is lowercase I intellect. So in the same way that the hypostasis soul contains all the souls within it, each soul has a part of it that is the intellect, which grasps the Platonic forms. And that part of soul always resides at the level of intellect. So Plotinus has this doctrine that's called the doctrine of the undescended intellect. So you and I, right now, at this very moment, a little piece of our soul is actually at the level of capital I intellect, grasping the Platonic forms. I haven't forgotten them in the sense that they've left my soul entirely. It's not that like being put into a body makes me forget them, because technically the soul is not put into a body for Plotinus. You don't have the same body soul interaction stuff in Plotinus. And then there's another part of the soul that's at the level of discursive reasoning, right? That's doing the kind of reasoning I'm doing right now so that I can explain to you what's going on with Plotinus. And then there's another part of the soul that looks after the body. Because this is the unfortunate status of a soul. Intellect generated soul, and soul had enough power to unify itself, get its act together, and do its own activity. Unfortunately, soul created bodies which cannot do that for themselves. And so to be a soul is basically to have, like, to always be looking after, as you know, I have a baby. And part of what it is to have a baby is You have to do so much for them. My whole day, I have to think about what she's going to eat, when she's going to sleep. I have to do so many things for her because she just can't do them herself. And so a huge part of my mind at all times is entirely preoccupied with my baby. And so I invite you to think about what it is like to be a soul for Plotinus as what it is like to be a parent. But imagine your child never grows up and can never figure out how to feed themselves, never decide when to go to bed. And so, what it's like to be a parent is to perpetually be distracted. I am always thinking about my baby. Students recently asked me if I hate that I commute an hour when I teach, and I said no, because for that 1 hour, I don't have to be thinking about my baby. I don't, she's not in my care. I don't have to think about that. My mind's liberated. So, what it is to be a soul is there's a part of you that, that is hanging out with the forms. There's a part of you that's doing the kind of reasoning that souls do. And there's a part of you that is perpetually looking after this body that cannot look after itself. It constantly needs food. It's constantly falling apart. It's constantly catching strep throat or this disease or that disease. And it's really annoying. And it's like pulling on your pant leg at all times. So, how do souls? So, souls are like these multi layered things. And Plotinus thinks that they're like Plotinus is kind of where we really get an account of the self or of attention. And basically, what happens is that the soul has like multiple demands on its attention because I can't simultaneously think about the forms and look after the body. Those are two different from one another. So the soul has to turn its attention in time from one object to another. Now the forms, they're always there, and they don't ask anything of me. They're just there and they're waiting for me when I come back. My body, that's not the case. And so what it is to be a soul is to constantly have my attention dragged towards my body. And in the same way that people often talk about, especially when they have small children, losing themselves, because all of their attention is towards this other being that's not even me. It's dear to me. I've made this being, but it's not strictly speaking me. Plotinus thinks that this is what happens to the soul. I've got this really needy body. It's taking up all of my time, and I forget myself. I forget there are other parts of my soul because all of my attention, all of the time is on the body. And I get so distracted, I forget those other parts exist. And I start to think what it is to be a soul is to be my body's keeper. And so that's what happens. I start thinking reality is this thing that's constantly demanding my time and attention.
Yeah, I mean, what an excellent, insightful answer that was. So I see where Plotinus is coming from a lot more now. So the idea is that there is a hypostasis intellect with a capital I. It's spending its time to the extent that we can talk about it in time at all, but it's preoccupied with contemplating these eternal paradigms or models we call the forms. It's not thinking about you or me, but it is thinking about the human. It's thinking about the horse, but not any particular horse. But then at the level of soul, you and I have intellects with a lowercase I that is our own personal intellect that in a way does exist in the intelligible realm in the sense that it's spending its time ideally contemplating the forms, but because it's embedded in a soul that itself has parts, there's a part of my soul that has to be distracted by things like diseases like strep throat or something necessary that's pulling at the pant leg of the soul. But it would be a very conscientious person who only stopped contemplating the forms to attend to that which was necessary, matters of health, matters of disease, matter of food. There are people who spend their whole lives chasing money, chasing bodily pleasure, and for them, we could say that it's not necessary that they spend their time doing that. What do you think Plotinus would say about someone who is not looking after their body or is not exclusively doing anything that could be really called paying attention to their body. But this is someone who might even wreck their body through the pursuit of pleasure or, many sleepless nights wondering how to get the next big commission check at work. Um, uh, is this the source of what we might call Plotinus's ethics or moral philosophy? This concern of losing yourself in something that is actually not necessary, but is merely, hedonistic or something debauched.
Yeah, Plotinus says like frustratingly little things about a lot of these subjects. He's like a big metaphysics guy, and he says there's only one Ennead on ethics, and it's quite short. And a lot of it is actually about how consciousness works. But yes, I think that there's something about if you start to so you know how you have the ladder of love in the symposium, and I look at beautiful bodies and it makes me think of beauty and I move up. I think Plotinus thinks you can have like a bad version, a bizarro version of that, where first I'm just focused on my body and I start to believe this is the level of reality. Once I'm sort of bamboozled or like totally mesmerized by the sensible world, I could very easily start to get fooled by other things. Maybe, so for example, pursuing pleasures. To look after my body is to satisfy appetites in a large way. So then I can start thinking that appetites are what matter. And I can very quickly move from necessary appetites to unnecessary appetites. Plotinus, unlike Plato, doesn't give us much of an etiology of how that happens, but as readers of Plato, we can imagine how you can move quickly from satisfying necessary desires to unnecessary desires. The pursuit of money is always going to be a short, like a hop, skip, and a jump from satisfying unnecessary desires because money ends up being a stand in for the ability to satisfy desires. So I think for Plotinus, once you get confused about what you are, it's quite easy for you to really become mistaken because you no longer have any grasp about what actually is good for your body and bad for your body. And consequently, you just completely lose a grip on what the whole point of having appetites in the first place is. You forget that you really only need to keep your body running because, in the same way that I need to keep my baby alive, because I made it and it's mine and I should look after it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, thank you. That utterly fascinating. Thanks, Rachel. Anything else you want to add here?
Just because we talked a little bit about how souls lose their way for Plotinus and they lose their lineage, I wanted to comment briefly on this peculiar factor of Plotinian ethics. Plotinus doesn't do ethics very much, um, but when he does do ethics, um, or when you think about the consequences of Plotinus's ethical theory, on the one hand, he spends a lot of time telling us how easy it is to get distracted by bodies and how we get drawn into this world and we forget our lineage. And it's easy to miss what's optimistic about Plotinus's metaphysics of the soul. I am always present to the one. I am always, even though I don't attend to it, I am always grasping the forms. So you don't get the Phaedrus where I have to like try to move my chariot and get up to the realm of the forms. I don't get this story of reincarnation where the body that I get reincarnated into might actually make my chances of living a good life long term as a soul better or worse. And Plotinus, again, he doesn't dwell on this very much, but I'm always struck by there's something really optimistic that technically at any point in your life, you could achieve ecstatic union with the one. Like it's available to you. It's not clear how hard it is, but at least in terms of the metaphysical picture, you are always with God for Plotinus. And he also tells us that there are souls that are capable of looking after bodies without getting bogged down in them. So he says, for example, the world soul is able to look after the cosmos without at all failing to also be like perfectly rational and think about the forms all the time. And that's striking to me because we're reading someone who will often warn you off about the sensible world because he really wants you to not get caught up in it. But he's also very careful to establish I'm not a Gnostic. I don't actually hate the body. I don't hate this world. This world is actually a product of goodness. And he's certainly not going to follow Plato in saying things like the body is a tomb. That doesn't seem to be Plotinus's view. And so, although he's worried about souls having forgotten their lineage, here's the flip side. You forgot your lineage, but do you know what your lineage is? It's God. Like you come from God. Like there's something sort of uplifting in that. And I just wanted to mention it as a feature of Plotinus's philosophy, which is the souls can forget their origin, but also our origin is extraordinarily easy to discover because we're not really away from the one.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. I mean, what a good clarification and what a powerful note to end this on. Thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
I'm more than happy to talk about Plotinus anytime.